In the time of chaos, when darkness threatened to consume the land, a lone warrior rose from obscurity. His name was Shamgar, and his story, though brief in the pages of history, echoes with the thunder of courage and faith. This is the untold story of the judge who killed 600 Philistines with nothing but an oxgoad. The land of Israel, once flowing with milk and honey, had become a place of sorrow and fear. The Philistines, fierce and merciless, had invaded their homes, pillaged their crops, and enslaved their people. The Israelites cried out for deliverance, longing for a savior to rise from among them. In a small village nestled among the rolling hills, a child was born, a child whose destiny would shake the very foundations of oppression. His name, Shamgar, son of Anath. Unlike the great warriors of Israel's past, Shamgar was no prince, nor was he a mighty soldier. He was a farmer, a man of the soil, tending his fields and leading his oxen in the quiet countryside. But fate, as it often does, had grander plans for this humble man. Legends whispered through the villages, speaking of a time when God would raise a deliverer from the most unexpected places. Old men sat by the fires, recounting prophecies passed down through generations. The Lord shall raise a hand from the field, a worker of the land, to scatter the oppressors like chaff in the wind. Some scoffed. Others waited in silent hope. Shamgar's mother, a woman of deep faith, often looked into the eyes of her son and wondered if he might be the fulfillment of such a prophecy. His father, a simple but wise man, taught him the ways of the land, the seasons of planting and harvest, and the art of patience and endurance. These lessons, though simple, would one day mold him into a man fit to lead. Shamgar's early years were not easy. The Philistine raiders struck without warning, taking livestock, grain, and even children to serve as slaves. Young Shamgar saw his family and friends suffer, and an anger began to burn within him, an anger not born of revenge, but of righteous justice. "Father," Shamgar would ask, gripping his wooden staff tightly, "why do we let them take everything from us?" His father's face was etched with wisdom and sorrow. "It is not our strength that will defeat them, my son, but the strength of the Lord. But when the time comes, he will show you the way." Even as a boy, Shamgar showed a natural strength, often ploughing the fields long after others had given up. His hands were calloused, his muscles hardened by labor, and his heart was set with a quiet determination. He did not yet know it, but the fields were his training ground, and the oxgoad, his weapon. The oxgoad, a simple tool, a wooden stick tipped with iron used by farmers to guide their oxen. Who would have thought that such an ordinary object would one day become a weapon of legend? In Shamgar's hands, it was more than a tool. It was an extension of his will. Even as a young man, Shamgar found comfort in its weight, twirling it between his fingers as he worked, striking imaginary enemies in the air, preparing for a fight that had yet to come. His friends laughed, calling him the dreamer, but deep down, Shamgar believed he was meant for something greater. One fateful evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Shamgar returned from the fields to find his village in ruins. The Philistines had struck again, this time taking his younger brother captive. The sight of his grieving mother broke him. Something inside him snapped, not in fury, but in resolve. That night, Shamgar knelt in the fields and prayed, his hands clenched around the oxgoad. "Lord, if you will use me, I will not fail. I am but a farmer, but my hands are yours." And thus the journey of a judge began. From that day forward, Shamgar was a man transformed. He could no longer look upon the suffering of his people and do nothing. He trained relentlessly, using every spare moment to hone his skill with the oxgoad. His resolve became unbreakable. He would fight, not with swords or chariots, but with the strength God had given him. Late at night, the elders of the village would watch him in silence, murmuring among themselves. Some called him foolish. Others whispered that perhaps, just perhaps, he was the one they'd been waiting for. "Why do you waste your time, Shamgar?" an old man once asked him. "You are but one man against many." Shamgar's eyes, filled with unwavering determination, met the elder's gaze. One man with God is enough. And so, his legend was set in motion. The whispers of hope stirred in the hearts of the people. Could it be that this humble farmer was the answer to their prayers? Time would soon reveal that Shamgar was more than they ever imagined. From the fields of toil to the battlefield of destiny, Shamgar's transformation was not immediate, but every trial, every hardship was a step toward his calling. Before he could fight with his hands, he had to fight with his heart. For years, Shamgar labored in obscurity. He was no king, no commander, just a man with an oxgoad and an unshakable belief that his people deserved freedom. The world around him seemed oblivious to his struggles, and the weight of oppression grew heavier with each passing day. Each morning he rose before dawn, working the fields with quiet diligence, but his mind was elsewhere, on the horizon, beyond the hills, where the Philistines roamed unchecked. At night, while others rested, Shamgar practiced alone, striking tree trunks with precision, his movements becoming swifter, more lethal. But patience was a lesson he had learned from the land. Just as the soil required time to bear fruit, so did his destiny. And so he waited, watching, preparing, listening for the voice of God to tell him when the time had come. His mother often watched him from the doorway of their home, her heart burdened by the weight of a destiny she could sense but not fully understand. "Shamgar," she called softly one evening, "come inside, son." "I will," he replied, panting from his latest set of practice strikes. "Soon." But Shamgar could not rest, not while his people suffered. As Shamgar grew into manhood, the Philistine raids became bolder. His people, once hopeful, had grown resigned to their fate. Fear had become a part of everyday life, woven into their routines, shaping their choices. One day, he visited the village elders, standing before them with a heart full of resolve. "How much longer will we endure this suffering?" he asked. "How much longer will we allow them to take our children, our crops, our dignity?" An elder sighed, his frail hands trembling. "We are but farmers, Shamgar. We do not have the weapons nor the numbers. It is the way of things." Shamgar's jaw tightened, his voice firm. A man with faith and courage is never outnumbered. But the elders only shook their heads. They had seen too much defeat, too much suffering, to believe in miracles. Shamgar left the meeting with a heavy heart, realizing that salvation would not come through words alone. It would come through action. The day that changed everything came without warning. Shamgar had been tending to his fields when he heard the distant sound of screams, shouts of terror carried on the wind. He dropped his plough and raced toward the village, his oxgoad gripped tightly in his calloused hands. There, in the heart of the village, stood a Philistine raiding party, their weapons gleaming in the afternoon sun. They were laughing, mocking, as they loaded carts with stolen grain and livestock. Women and children cowered, while the men stood frozen, too afraid to act. Shamgar felt his pulse quicken. His eyes locked onto the leader of the raiders, a towering man clad in iron. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He stepped forward, his oxgoad spinning effortlessly in his grip. "Enough!" his voice rang out, startling the invaders. They turned to face him, their laughter fading into curiosity. One of them sneered, "What are you going to do, farmer? Poke us with your stick?" Shamgar's grip tightened. "No," he said calmly, "I'm going to send you back to your gods, empty-handed." And with that, he lunged forward. The first blow struck hard, shattering the jaw of the nearest Philistine. With a swift pivot, Shamgar spun the oxgoad, sweeping another raider off his feet. His movements were fluid, practiced, every strike finding its mark. The villagers watched in awe as Shamgar moved like a force of nature, striking down enemy after enemy. Dust swirled in the air, screams filled the silence, and the Philistines, once so sure of their victory, now found themselves overwhelmed by a single man. The Philistine leader snarled in rage, charging at Shamgar with a mighty sword, but Shamgar sidestepped, driving his oxgoad deep into the man's side. The raider collapsed, gasping for breath as the rest of his men fled in terror. When the last Philistine fell, Shamgar stood in the center of the village, breathing heavily, his oxgoad stained with blood. Silence settled over the crowd. The villagers, who had once doubted him, now looked upon him with newfound respect and hope. News of Shamgar's victory spread quickly. People from neighboring villages came to see the man who had defeated an entire raiding party with nothing but a farming tool. The whispers grew louder. Could he be the one God has sent to deliver us? But Shamgar did not seek fame. He returned to his fields, his oxgoad always by his side, prepared for the next attack. However, he soon realized that one battle would not be enough. The Philistines would return stronger and more determined, and so Shamgar began to train others. He gathered the strongest men from the villages, teaching them how to fight with what they had: wooden staffs, stones, farming tools. He taught them courage, resilience, and most importantly, faith. Victory does not belong to the strong, he told them. It belongs to the faithful. But being a warrior was one thing, being a leader was another. Shamgar struggled with the weight of responsibility. People looked to him for guidance, for wisdom beyond his years. He often found himself alone at night, staring at the stars, seeking answers from God. "Am I truly the one you've chosen?" he would whisper. Yet every morning he rose with renewed purpose, determined to lead his people out of fear and into strength. One evening, an old woman approached him, placing a trembling hand on his arm. "You are our hope, Shamgar," she said. "Do not turn away from what you are meant to do." Her words echoed in his heart. He could no longer be just a farmer. He had become a judge, a leader, a deliverer. With a single act of courage, Shamgar proved that a lone man, armed with faith and determination, could defy the odds. But the battle was far from over. The Philistines were relentless, and Shamgar's fight had only just begun. Despite Shamgar's victory over the raiding party, peace did not last long. The Philistines, enraged by their humiliating defeat, regrouped and prepared for retaliation. Their spies moved through the land, gathering intelligence, watching Shamgar closely. Meanwhile, the villagers who had once doubted him now looked to him for leadership. They came to him in droves, seeking guidance, protection, and hope. Some brought their children, eager to train them in the ways of courage. Others brought food and supplies, offering what little they had to support the cause. Shamgar stood atop a hill overlooking the village, watching as farmers, shepherds, and craftsmen gathered below. Their faces were filled with uncertainty, yet a spark of determination flickered in their eyes. He knew that if they were to survive, they had to unite. "Brothers," Shamgar called out, his voice echoing across the valley, "we can no longer live in fear. We must take a stand, not just for our homes, but for our children, for our future." Murmurs spread through the crowd. A young man stepped forward. But Shamgar, we are not warriors. We have no swords, no armor. Shamgar lifted his oxgoad, his grip firm. Weapons do not win battles. Courage does. If I can defeat them with this, he said, pointing to his weapon, then together we can drive them from our land. An elder stepped forward, nodding. We will follow you, Shamgar, but you must teach us how to fight. Training began at dawn and ended long after sunset. Shamgar turned farmers into fighters, teaching them to use their tools, sickles, plows, and axes, as weapons. He emphasized discipline and strategy, showing them how to fight in formation, how to strike swiftly and retreat before the Philistines could respond. At first, their movements were clumsy and their strikes lacked power, but Shamgar was patient. Strength is not enough, he would say, guiding them. You must learn to think like warriors. He divided them into squads, assigning captains and organizing drills that mimicked real battles. They practiced striking dummies, fashioned from straw and wood, learning to aim for the weak spots of an enemy's armor. They ran long distances to build stamina and lifted heavy stones to strengthen their bodies. Days turned into weeks, and soon the once timid villagers began to show signs of confidence. Shamgar drilled them in endurance, agility, and unity. He taught them the importance of standing together, reminding them that their strength was not in their weapons, but in their unity and trust in God. At night, Shamgar prayed alone, seeking wisdom and strength. Lord, I am but a man, he whispered, but with you I know all things are possible. Guide my hand and make me an instrument of your will. It wasn't long before the Philistines returned. This time, in greater numbers, they stormed into the region, burning fields and looting homes, determined to crush any resistance before it could grow. The villagers, though fearful, stood their ground. Shamgar led them in strategic ambushes, using their knowledge of the land to their advantage. They struck swiftly from the hills and valleys, taking the enemy by surprise and retreating before the Philistines could respond. One by one, the Philistine patrols fell. Shamgar's men grew bolder with each victory, and the oppressors soon realized they were no longer facing mere farmers, but a force that would not be broken. One evening, as Shamgar and his men rested after a skirmish, a scout rushed into the camp. They come in greater numbers, my lord, he panted. Their army marches towards us. Shamgar's face darkened. Then we will face them head-on, he said, his voice unwavering. As dawn broke, the villagers gathered on the hillside, looking down upon the advancing Philistine army. Shields gleamed, and war cries filled the air. Fear rippled through the ranks, but Shamgar strode before them, oxgoad in hand. We fight today not for glory but for freedom, he shouted. The Lord fights with us. The villagers roared in response. Shamgar's heart swelled with pride as he saw their resolve. The battle was fierce. The Philistines, armed with superior weapons, pressed forward, but Shamgar and his men fought with the fury of those protecting their homes. The oxgoad, wielded with precision, became a weapon of legend, felling enemy after enemy. At one point, a Philistine captain towering over Shamgar sneered, "You fight with a stick, farmer!" Shamgar's response was swift, a strike to the head, and the giant fell. It is not the weapon, but the warrior who wields it, Shamgar said, standing tall. Hours passed, and the battlefield was littered with bodies. Finally, the Philistines retreated, their morale shattered. Victory belonged to Shamgar and his men. In the aftermath, Shamgar's name spread beyond the borders of his village. Merchants and travelers spoke of the judge who had saved his people with nothing but an oxgoad. His people looked to him as a leader, a protector. But Shamgar remained humble. "I am not a king," he told them. "I am but a servant of the Lord." Despite his victories, Shamgar knew the battle for Israel's freedom was not yet over. The Philistines were weakened, but not defeated. He began forming alliances with neighboring villages, sharing his tactics and encouraging others to stand against their oppressors. Israel was beginning to awaken. One evening, as Shamgar looked out over the hills, his mother stood beside him. "You have become more than I ever imagined, my son," she said softly. Shamgar smiled. "It was never me, mother. It was always God." He knew his purpose had been fulfilled, but he also understood that the fight would continue for generations. "We must remain vigilant," he said to his men. "For as long as evil rises, there will always be a need for those willing to stand." A single act of defiance had sparked a revolution, but Shamgar's greatest test was yet to come. The battle that would define his legacy loomed on the horizon. 600 Philistine warriors, armed to the teeth, marching toward his people, and Shamgar stood alone, oxgoad in hand, ready to make his final stand. The Philistines were relentless in their pursuit to crush Israel's spirit. After Shamgar's previous victories, their humiliation festered into a thirst for vengeance. They mustered an elite force of 600 warriors, seasoned veterans who had fought in countless battles, wielding swords and spears crafted from the finest iron. In the grand halls of Ashdod, the Philistine warlord Makar pounded his fist against the stone table. "This man, Shamgar, has become a plague to our dominion. He must be destroyed before the rest of Israel rises against us." His generals nodded in agreement. One of them, a grizzled veteran named Oram, spoke. "He's but a farmer wielding a stick. Send me with our finest warriors, and I will bring you his head." Meanwhile, in the village of Gibeath, Shamgar stood atop a hill, watching the distant dust cloud of the advancing army. His people trembled, knowing what was coming. "They march upon us, my lord," a scout reported breathlessly. Shamgar nodded. "Then we will not wait for them to take what is ours. We will meet them in the valley." His captains exchanged uneasy glances. "But Shamgar," Eliab said, "we are outnumbered. We have no armor, no real weapons." Shamgar placed a reassuring hand on his friend's shoulder. "Victory is not found in steel, Eliab. It is found in faith." That night Shamgar gathered the villagers in the center of the settlement. The flickering torches illuminated their worried faces. "Tomorrow," he began, "we face a force greater than any we have known. But fear not. We will fight with what we have, and we will fight for our homes." He instructed the men to fashion weapons from their tools. Scythes were reforged into blades, pitchforks were hardened over fire, and wooden plough handles were reinforced with iron tips. Shamgar personally trained the younger men, showing them how to strike with precision and retreat swiftly. Among them was a boy named Joram, barely old enough to lift a weapon. He looked up at Shamgar with wide eyes. "Will we win, my lord?" Shamgar knelt, gripping the boy's shoulders firmly. "Courage wins battles, Joram. Trust in the Lord, and we cannot fail." The women and elders prepared supplies, gathering water and food for the battle ahead. Prayers were whispered in every home that night, and Shamgar himself knelt in the fields he once tilled, seeking divine strength. "Lord, I am only a farmer," he whispered, "but if it is your will, I will stand for my people." At dawn, the valley of Gaza lay silent as Shamgar led his people forward. The Philistines, adorned in gleaming armor, waited on the opposite side. Their war cries echoed through the air, a thunderous declaration of their power. Shamgar walked ahead of his people, his ox-goad resting across his shoulders. The Philistine general Oram stepped forward, sneering. "Is this Israel's great warrior, a man with a stick?" Shamgar's eyes burned with determination. "This stick has brought down your kind before. It will again." Oram laughed and signaled his men to advance. With a roar, the Philistines charged. Shamgar gripped his oxgoad tightly, feeling the familiar weight in his hands. "For the Lord!" he bellowed, and with a mighty swing he brought the oxgoad crashing into the nearest enemy's skull, dropping him instantly. The villagers followed his lead, clashing with the Philistines in a chaotic battle of raw survival. Shamgar moved with unmatched speed, striking down enemies left and right. He sidestepped an incoming spear and countered with a crushing blow to an attacker's ribs. The battlefield became a whirlwind of dust and cries. Despite their lack of experience, Shamgar's people fought with desperation and heart, using their knowledge of the terrain to outmaneuver their foes. The Philistines, though better equipped, were unprepared for Shamgar's relentless assault. His oxgoad whirled through the air with lethal precision. He struck low and fast, toppling armored warriors and sowing confusion in their ranks. They fought alongside him, using his scythe like a blade. "We can win this," he shouted, hope rising in his voice. But then disaster struck. A Philistine chariot pulled by 2 horses charged directly toward Shamgar. He barely managed to dive aside, rolling to his feet just in time to parry an incoming sword strike. The charioteer sneered down at him. "You cannot stop us, farmer!" With a surge of strength, Shamgar leapt onto the chariot, driving his oxgoad through the driver's chest and seizing the reins. He steered the chariot directly into the Philistine ranks, scattering their formation and giving his people an opening. The villagers pressed forward, their courage reignited by Shamgar's audacity. The battle raged on, and Shamgar fought tirelessly. The Philistine numbers dwindled, and soon their morale broke. Realizing they could not defeat a man so relentless, they began to retreat. Shamgar, breathing heavily, stood amidst the fallen, his oxgoad slick with blood. The ground was littered with the bodies of the enemy, and the fields of Israel were safe once more. The villagers erupted in cheers, embracing each other with tears of relief and joy. Shamgar lifted his oxgoad to the sky, his voice ringing out, "No, the Lord has delivered us." Though the battle was won, Shamgar knew this was only a temporary reprieve. The Philistines would return, but for now Israel could rest. The people began rebuilding their homes, inspired by the knowledge that they were no longer helpless. A man approached Shamgar as he stood overlooking the valley. "We owe you everything," he said softly. Shamgar shook his head and said, "No, we owe everything to God. I was just a vessel." Years later, Shamgar's story was told throughout Israel as a testament to faith and courage. His oxgoad became a symbol of resistance and hope, a reminder that strength does not come from weapons, but from the heart. And though Shamgar eventually returned to his quiet life as a farmer, his legacy lived on. Parents told their children of the judge who stood alone against 600 warriors, and his name was forever etched in the annals of history. Victory on the battlefield was only the beginning. Shamgar's greatest challenge was not in defeating the Philistines, but in leading his people toward lasting peace and strength. His wisdom and influence would shape a generation, but with leadership came trials far greater than war. After Shamgar's legendary victory over the Philistines, the land was quiet for a time. Word of his triumph spread beyond the borders of Israel, and neighboring tribes marveled at the farmer-turned-warrior who had defied an empire with nothing but an oxgoad and faith. But peace is never easy to maintain. Though the enemy had fled, the land was still scarred by years of oppression. The people looked to Shamgar not just as a hero, but as a leader who could guide them out of the shadow of fear and into the light of freedom. Shamgar, however, did not see himself as a ruler. He was a simple man of the soil, and the thought of leading an entire nation weighed heavily on his heart. As Shamgar's legacy continued to live on, one lesson stood above the rest. God does not call the equipped, he equips the called. It was a reminder that no matter one's background or resources, anyone could be used for great purposes if they were willing to trust and act with faith. And so, the story of Shamgar became a guiding light, reminding all who heard it that with courage and faith, no enemy was too great to overcome. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the incredible story of Shamgar and want to hear more powerful biblical stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Hit the like button if you found this inspiring, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us bring more amazing content your way. Subscribe now and be part of our journey.